Hello again and welcome to this video on the use of 44 Magnum as a gun for the bush. We're going to be talking about the use of a revolver, why it's the better choice, and why in particular 44 Magnum is a good way to go. And in this video I'm going to delve into a lot of topics, not just why a 44 Magnum is best, why a revolver is the best to use, but I'm also going to talk about how to get good with shooting one. And there's a lot of pitfalls to be encountered when learning to shoot a 44 Magnum, and I know that a lot of people start off with one and they eventually give up because it gets pretty frustrating. So this video is going to cover a pretty wide set of issues. Now I'm going to do something a little bit unusual with this video. I'm starting off begging your forgiveness, okay? I'm sorry, I'm very sorry, but I'm just I have so much to cover in this video that the only way I could really do it effectively, I thought at least, is to refer to a set of notes. And usually I just kind of go right off the top of my head and get her done, you know. But this subject, there's so many little side roads to go into and a lot of things that I don't want to miss. So I've written up a script, and I'm going to put a link to the actual script that I'm going by in the notes. You can pull it off. Should be able to get it off a Google Drive location that I make available to you, so that you can read through what I'm going to say in this video. So okay, you know, if you get really put off by my delivery, maybe just download the document and read that. I don't mind. It's okay. It's I've been reviewing this video, and I gotta admit it's pretty poor, and I'm gonna have to work on some other method. Maybe either that or just kind of take my chances and go without a script in the future. So that being said, we're gonna go now into the video. And I hope you like it. I try to spend as little time as I can looking at my notes, but really there's going to be a lot of the video where I'm looking at my notes over here, seeing where I got to go next, and trying to spend as much time as I can face on with the camera. But it's, boy, if you haven't done this before yourself, it's pretty tricky. It's difficult to do. So bear with me and let's get started. This is a really useful subject. I really think this is a video that needs to be out there, and I think it could help a lot of people. A lot of really good shooting tips for people, including how to make ammunition cheap, the whole bag. So let's see how this goes, and we'll see if you last till the end or not. Hello and welcome back to the Way to Native Chronicles. On the topic of handguns, I've seen a lot of advice given and feel there's a need to deal specifically with the subject of using handguns for protection in the wilderness. This video is not saying that everyone's advice is wrong. It's just that the treatment tends to emphasize the human conflict angle, as if that's everything. And perhaps that's not surprising, since the majority of people live in urban settings, and that's what's most on their minds when it comes to handguns. But such advice is not applicable when it comes to protecting yourself against dangerous animals in the bush. This video will speak to that issue, making the case for Magnum revolvers while doing so. To begin with, the areas where the usual advice is inapplicable are the hitting power required. 44 Magnum should be considered the baseline. The shooting stance required. Weaver stance is not really the best. The shooting distances involved tends to be longer for wilderness settings. Holster requirements. You know, we're dealing with outdoor conditions, also in the snow. Reliability and simplicity. Magazine capacity. It's We're not talking about back and forth gun battles here. And then finally, special training needs, and this delves into the cost of training and the methods of doing so. So let's begin. Let's start with hitting power. Stopping an angry animal like a grizzly is a tall order, and handgun cartridges like 9mm or 45 ACP, they're not really up to the task. For maximum flexibility when it comes to powerful loads, revolvers and the cartridges they're capable of using are clearly the best. Reasons for using a revolver are: you don't have to worry about a load sticking in the chamber because you have a separate chamber for each cartridge. You don't have to avoid large meplat, flat-nosed bullets to facilitate feeding through a magazine in a semi-automatic. And thirdly, many good revolvers are designed to handle 44 Magnum and larger cartridges easily. If you're faced with stopping an angry 1,000-pound animal, a cartridge designed for stopping 200-pound people is not enough. A 45 ACP round, even a 357 Magnum, to be quite honest, may just bounce off the skull of a grizzly bear or be stopped by other large bones. Next, we should deal with dimensional considerations. Now, let's rule out a consideration that doesn't apply to wilderness protection. And it's one that's usually the strong point for semi-automatics. That consideration is concealability. Concealability is generally one of the strongest arguments favoring semis, but it doesn't apply for wilderness protection. In fact, in the bush, you do not need to conceal your handgun. Indeed, local laws may prohibit you from doing so. So don't sacrifice power, functionality, and reliability for that, even if you are fond of semi-autos, and I know a lot of you are. What you need is a Magnum category revolver, something that is easy to operate and reliable. Choice of revolver comes next. In this video I'll be making the case for using revolvers, more specifically recommending the venerable 44 Magnum. In my opinion, the 44 Magnum provides the best mix of power and handling, and because you have to be able to hit what you're aiming at. So it's best not to overdo it in the power department. On the other side of the coin, you also still need sufficient power, and the 44 Magnum probably provides the best trade-off between the two, in my opinion. A lot of people love their single-action revolvers, but for wilderness protection, you're likely to be better served with a double-action, even if you usually fire it in a single-action mode. The reasons for this are twofold. In a last-ditch effort, when an animal is on you or just about to be on you, you can pull the trigger repeatedly and empty a gun into it using double action. Carrying a speed loader or two with you, you can reload an empty double action much quicker than a single action. And let's keep in mind that it may not be your own life that you're saving. You could be protecting your partner, stopping an animal from mauling him or her. So let's move on next to reliability and simplicity of operation. Besides being superior for training, which I'll cover later, the arguments for and against revolvers are really endless. But for wilderness needs, the analysis becomes simpler. In addition to their general ability to handle Magnum loads and facilitate ball and dummy practice, revolvers are simpler to operate at times of stress. There's no safety, there's no chance of a round not being chambered. They're reliable. Many revolver shooters, such as myself, can testify to the fact that their revolver has never failed, even after decades and many thousands of rounds of shooting. Even if a cartridge is to misfire, the third point, perhaps you fell in a creek earlier in the day. If that cartridge misfires, you can pull the trigger or cock the hammer onto a new new chamber on a revolver, and now you've got a fresh round underneath your hammer. And if that one doesn't go off, you can have a third and a fourth try at it, right? The gun isn't going to jam on account of a misfire. Now let's move on to the subject of training cost. One way to predict what you're capable of is this. In a real-life crisis situation where you have to defend yourself, assume that you will shoot only half as good as your worst day practicing on the range. So set your training goal to become twice as good as you need to be. Because most experts have access to lots of inexpensive ammunition, perhaps being sponsored or whatever, an overlooked aspect of training is the high cost of ammunition when it comes to Magnum handguns, and the training you need to be involved in. Shooting a Magnum handgun requires practice, a lot of practice, and unlike ammo available for semi-autos like the 9mm, it's far more expensive. Where I live, a box of 44 Magnum ammo costs about $50 for 50 cartridges. 50 cartridges is what you're going to need for a typical practice session at the range. So if you practice very often, it becomes a pretty expensive proposition. One that is more than most people can realistically afford, I think, especially on an ongoing basis. For instance, 2 to 4 times a month going out to the range to shoot. Making your own ammunition, you can make a box of 50 cartridges for in the neighborhood of $5. The bullets are the most expensive component of the cartridge that you're going to reload next to the brass case. So if you cast your own bullets, you can bring that cost way down, and you can make your own bullets casting from materials like wheel weight metal. By doing so, I can bring my cost per box of 50 down to $5, which is a real advantage. At that price, I can go out and I can practice lots and regularly. Another thing about the cast bolts is the same loads you use for practice are the ones you can use for wilderness protection, because a hard cast bullet is capable of penetrating deeply into a large aggressive game, and that's what you want. So when you practice, you can practice with the same ammunition that you're going to be using out in the field. That's a real bonus. Unlike semi-autos, revolvers can handle semi-wadcutter style bullets, so your choice of bullets to use is far less constrained by the design of the handgun. Another plus for revolvers. If you're just starting out and want to get proficient using a Magnum handgun, I suggest you bite the bullet, so to speak, and factor bullet casting equipment into the anticipated initial cash outlay, because you're going to need to shoot that handgun a lot and in order to get good at it. So maybe consider just going that route right off the bat. That's what I did over 40 years ago, and definitely haven't regretted it. So something to think about. Okay, let's move on next to the training method for Magnum handguns. When it comes to training, revolvers offer an easy way of incorporating ball and dummy practice into your practice sessions. Flinching can be a huge problem with Magnum handguns, okay? And it has to be checked constantly if you're to become proficient. When you use a revolver, it's simple to leave some of the cylinders empty or filled with spent empty cases. You then spin the cylinder and then close it so that you don't know where the live rounds are. Then as you start shooting, when the hammer falls on a dud round, you'll know right away whether or not you're flinching. Flinch is something that you want to catch as soon as possible before it becomes an ingrained habit. So let's be very frank about this. If you have any flinch shooting, you're not going to hit your target. With a handgun especially. That's just plain and simple, so you really have to work on that. This is a factor regarding Magnum handguns that's often not appreciated and addressed enough, and it really reinforces what I said earlier about the need for a lot of practice when it comes to a Magnum handgun. Through a lot of practice, and it takes a lot, you need to mentally condition yourself to become immune to flinching. That's not easy, but it is something you can do. Okay, let's move on now to the matter of double action versus single action operation when you're using a revolver. I probably have a minority opinion on this, and I realize a lot of people, they prefer double action for all their shooting. But my personal opinion is that the single action is the best. I believe that's the case because you can shoot more accurately using the single action. Distances do tend to be a little greater out in the wilderness. And Magnum revolvers recoil so much that it's easy to cock the hammer with your support hand thumb as the muzzle descends. So that makes single action use really just as fast as double action anyways. So you get your speed and you get your accuracy as a benefit. And this is especially in the case of Magnum handguns. What I'll show you next is just a brief clip of what I mean about how you cock the hammer on a revolver as the gun's muzzle is coming down. There's an important caveat to shooting single action, however, and if you choose single action as your shooting style, you must, and I repeat, must, make a concerted effort to always check the hammer position of your revolver every single time that you reholster it. Think about this. Now, if you are ever in a situation where you need to defend yourself from attack, you may not fire all 6 cartridges. For instance, you may have even just cocked the hammer in anticipation when you see an animal and that appears like it's going to attack you. But then the animal doesn't attack, or it stops its charge, or whatever. Now, in the midst of the excitement, you forget that you have the hammer cocked, and you put the gun with its 2 or 3 pound hammer, trigger I should say, back in your holster. That hammer is now cocked and it's ready to be touched off accidentally, perhaps much later in the day. This is very dangerous. For this reason, you should constantly drill yourself to check the hammer each time you holster a revolver. This is especially important if you are a single action shooter or shooting a double action in single action mode. This has to be something that just becomes ingrained in you so that you just do it automatically. This advice could really save your life, so I want to emphasize that. Now let's deal with what I'll call a double action myth. Don't be fooled by stories from police departments requiring double action use with the revolvers, more in the old days when revolvers were the norm in police departments. Yes, it's true, they used to require double action use, but the reasons that they encourage that have nothing to do with wilderness protection situations. The reason that it's not applicable is that in urban defense, for one thing, the distances are going to be generally a lot shorter, so less accuracy is required. The other reason is that police are sometimes tasked with sweeping an area of a building, let's say, where innocent persons may reside, right? And such people may pop into view unexpectedly, surprising the officer. Now, if you have a handgun with cocked in single action mode, you don't want a hair trigger reaction to result in accidentally shooting a person like that. But if you're using always just a long double action pull, it's much less likely that that's going to happen. So that is a big reason, very big reason for using double action with revolvers for police departments. And if you think about it, in the wild, there's not such an amount of extreme caution required to prevent shooting innocent animals. Okay, so let's just rule that reasoning out. Double actions, like Smith & Wessons have, they have just beautiful, crisp triggers, and to be quite honest, it's sort of a shame to waste that. It gives you a lot more accuracy, and it makes them very fine shooting handguns. So the next thing we should move on to is Magnum handguns and trigger control. We're going to take a deep dive into some of this, so I hope you have a few minutes, but you may benefit from some of it. On the subject of proper trigger control, it becomes especially important to accept the fact that while you're shooting, your sights are going to wander a little bit as you're aiming. No one holds perfectly steady. There's always a little bit of waver. It gets less as you become more proficient, but it's always going to be there to some extent. Because your sights will never be absolutely motionless on your target, you have to reconcile yourself to the fact that you have to let that shot go sometime during that aiming process. It sounds a little strange. Let me explain. A big problem is that many people try to pick a time for the gun to go off, thinking, I'm on the bullseye right now, so if the hammer falls at before this moment passes, I'm going to hit it. So they hurry their trigger pull, jerking the gun while they do it before the sights wander off the bullseye, and then they wonder later on why their bullet hits in a very different place from where they thought it would. They may then start thinking, no, maybe my sights are off, and start tinkering with their sights. So they do that next, and down the wrong road they go. It can be very frustrating for a new shooter, especially if that handgun the new shooter is using as a Magnum. If you're a new shooter, perhaps this even sounds familiar, what I've just described. Snapping shots to catch that brief instant when the sights stay on target seems to make sense, but it's not the right way to go about it. What you have to do instead is to begin increasing pressure on the trigger once you have your sights on the target. Imperfect as that non-stationary state may be of your sights. And once you begin squeezing, keep on squeezing and increasing the pressure on your trigger. Mostly trying to not jerk the trigger when the trigger's sear finally breaks and the hammer falls. The smoothness of that trigger pull should be your primary concern, not really the sights. Focus more on the trigger. In effect, what you're attempting to do when you're shooting is two things at the same time, and that's why shooting handguns is so challenging actually. You're attempting to keep the sights on target while at the same time pulling the trigger. Not only will a gradual trigger pull prevent jerking the gun when the hammer falls, but a more gradual increase of pressure on the trigger will cause the sights to shift less while you're pulling. So you have less shift of the sights as you're increasing pressure, and also when the gun goes off, the gun is not jerked. So you win both ways. Some of the best practice you can do is by dry firing. When you dry fire, the jerkiness or lack of it of your trigger pull is going to become clearly evident, not hidden by the recoil motion of your gun as it goes off. The more you practice, the less your sights will jerk as you engage in this dry fire practice. So to recap, when you're dry firing, you have to focus on getting that trigger pull, the gradual increase of that trigger pull, so gradual that when the trigger does finally break and the hammer falls, the sights don't move, not even a little bit. There can't be any motion at all. You can try balancing a coin on the front sight just to see if you can let that hammer down without the coin falling off, for instance. So that's something you should focus on. It's cheap to dry fire practice, and the experts do it a lot. So if you're able to increase the pressure on your trigger like that while holding your sights, keeping your sights from wavering too much, that's how you're going to become a good shot with a handgun. So as I said, the worst thing you can do is to pick a time for your gun to go off, especially when a Magnum handgun is involved. When you pick a time for the gun to go off, two bad things are going to happen. You're going to jerk the trigger, and secondly, you're going to develop a flinch. You will develop a flinch doing it that way. The way to inoculate yourself from the flinch is sort of basically by doing your shooting in such a way that you don't know exactly when the gun is going to go off. That's kind of the secret there. Don't be misled by the fact that once in a while, when you pull the trigger as you see the sights aligned on the target, that you get a good shot off. You just got away with it that time. In the long run, that approach is going to degrade your shooting, especially so when it comes to Magnums. Might get away with a little bit more with a 22, for instance. Also, avoid the habit of beginning to increase the pressure on your trigger and then backing off when the sights start to slightly wander off the target, and then starting to increase the pressure on the trigger again once the sights start to come back on target. Doing it that way just messes you up, plain and simple. If you see someone at the range and they're taking a long time to aim, and they finally give up and put the gun down because their arms are tired, and then they go and they give it another shot, it's somewhat likely that that's exactly what's going on. They're kind of doing a stop and go, and really once you get into that, it can be a mental battle. It almost becomes impossible to pull the trigger. So don't do the stop and pull. Just don't start to increase pressure. Just once you start to commit to increasing pressure on the trigger, just keep on going. If you execute a steady trigger pull from start to finish, you'll develop a smooth shooting cadence over time. By that I mean, you perform a smooth trigger pull that is consistent, and it begins at the time that your sights are aligned on the target, and it proceeds through to the shot going off finally. Don't be concerned if once in a while you let a shot off and your sights have moved a little off the target, just because you've committed to that trigger pull. Over time that'll get better. In the meantime, it's far better to make sure that your trigger pull is the best it can possibly be, and without any flinching. The idea is to make sight alignment and trigger pull a unified process, if you can get where I'm going with this. That's something to be performed together in unison, rather than switching your attention from sights to trigger and trigger to sights back and forth. Practicing in this way, you'll find that once you develop a cadence, you're still not picking a time for the hammer to fall. Instead, the shooting is just a fluid process, one that begins from the start point right through to the end, and everything happening at the same time. Begin slow and smooth, and you'll become faster naturally. Learning to ride a motorcycle through twisty roads is sort of the same thing. Smooth is fast. You don't start by going fast. You let your speed develop naturally. Begin by going slow. focusing on the mechanics of the process, and that way you build this into your muscle memory, and eventually you'll start going faster. It's even without trying. You can measure yourself on your training by asking yourself a question. After the shot goes off, were you slightly surprised or weren't you? If you were slightly surprised, that's actually a good sign, because it shows that you haven't really predicted the time for the hammer to fall. You've just been increasing the pressure on your trigger. You'll also be able to recall probably where your sights were at the time that the shot went off. So if the bullet hits in a place that's far different from where you recall the sights being when the shot went off, that might be a sign that you should start to focus a little bit on your trigger pull or your grip. Okay, so speaking of grip, let's move on to the subject of Magnum handguns and grip. To shoot a revolver well in single action mode, it's best to use your thumb for cocking the hammer. That's the thumb of your supporting hand, this one here. I saw a video recently where an instructor recommended crossing the thumb over, sort of like this. So they recommended putting your thumb over like that, and then you can cock like that. Bad idea, bad idea. Don't do that. Because, you know, if you're ever planning to shoot a semi-automatic someday, that habit of having your thumb crossed over is going to hurt a lot, because the slide of the gun is going to come back and rip the top part of your thumb off. Okay, so it's far better just to get your thumb to rest on the side. Then you can cock it, cock, cock, and then if you want, you can use this thumb when you're shooting. You can press down on the lower thumb to buckle it right in. Myself, I prefer to just kind of let it rest there, but whatever method you use, just be consistent about it. With the handgun also, you want to hold the grip high on it. So you don't want to hold the gun low. You want to hold it high so that your hand is closer to the center line of the bore. That's going to help reduce the muzzle flip and let you get off your subsequent shots quicker. So that's another thing to keep in mind with the Magnum handgun. The reason that we cock the hammer with the left thumb is also to do with consistency of grip, because this hand is your strong hand. Changing the grip on this hand is going to result in the most deviation of your shots. But if you don't change that grip by using your left hand to do the cocking of the hammer, then that's going to give you far better consistency. So that's the subject of grip for a Magnum. There's one other thing I should mention when it comes to the grip, especially as it relates to a Magnum, is having an inconsistent grip is going to just magnify your errors. That's because with a Magnum, when the gun goes off, it moves a lot, much more than, let's say, a .22 would move. So basically when the primer is ignited, the gun is sort of pointed in the, if it's sighted in to hit at something, let's say, horizontally from you, the sights are aligned pointing down actually a little bit, because when the hammer hits the primer and the primer goes off, as soon as the cartridge ignites, the gun starts to rotate. And depending on how hard you grip the grip of the gun, that's going to affect the speed, the rate of rise of your muzzle. And so maybe not many people know this, but that's what makes this so tricky, especially with Magnums. So what's actually happening is you're pointing down here when you pull the trigger, the cartridge ignites, the bullet starts moving down the barrel, and as it's moving down the barrel, it's approaching the end of the barrel here, and just as it approaches, exits the barrel, that's when it has to be on a flight path to hit your target. So if you hold the gun really tight and you don't let it come up, the bullet comes out when the gun is pointed lower. If you hold the gun light, then the gun just swings free like that, like on a hinge, and the bullet might exit the barrel like that. So it can make a huge amount of difference what angle the barrel is pointed when the bullet finally exits the muzzle, depending on how hard you grip the gun, and that also is affected by the velocity of the bullet in the barrel, all those type of things. But just keep that in mind if you, as far as magnums go, they're really sensitive to maintaining a proper, consistent grip. The next thing we should deal with, I guess, is shooting stance, and this is another area where the standard advice doesn't really apply to wilderness situations using Magnum handguns. You'll see many people advising you to use the Weaver stance, and the Weaver stance is one where you have your one arm extended and you have your supporting hand cocked a little bit and you're kind of angled at the target. I mean, it's a very nice stance for shooting accurately, but it's not really applicable to the wilderness for defense situations. The reasons it isn't is that in the wilderness you don't need to provide a narrow stance like this so that oncoming fire doesn't hit you, so that your opponent doesn't shoot, because your opponent's going to be trying to shoot back at you. So that's not an advantage you need with grizzly bears or cougars or things like that. There's also the factor that if you're defending yourself from wild animal attack, that animal may be running right at you, and if you can't stop him in his tracks in time, it's very likely that you might have to dodge left or right. So if you're facing in an isosceles stance towards the animal with your legs slightly bent in an athletic style, you want to be ready to be able to move this way or that, and hopefully dodge the animal if you don't stop them in time. So that's something to be considered. The other thing is with a .44 Magnum, unlike something like a 9mm or many other semi-autos, if you're going to fire all 6 shots through a .44 Magnum, you simply got to have your knees bent and you've got to be leaning forward into that gun like that. Because if you don't, by the 3rd or 4th shot, every time you shoot the gun, it's going to bounce you back a little further, and then you're going to have to regain your footing and get your balance back, and then continue shooting. So that's not a very good way to get off 6 very fast shots at an animal. You want to have an isosceles stance, your feet slightly spread, knees bent a little bit, and leaning good forward into the gun so that the shots don't rock you back. And maybe I'll include a little video clip on that to illustrate that. Okay, finally we're going to deal with the subject of the draw. Drawing a revolver from a holster, it's something that requires a lot of practice to do it safely, and it's something really deserving of a video on its own. So I've actually created a separate video for that, and I'll include a link to that in the description. But for now, let's just kind of I'll just mention the main points of it. One of them is that it's a good idea to have the holster on the strong side of your body. The reason for that is that when you're drawing it out, you don't sweep any part of your body as you're doing so. And while you're drawing the gun, while you're drawing it, you want to keep this hand close to your body so that as the gun comes out, it doesn't sweep your hand here. So your draw should come like that and then out to the target. That's basically the mechanics of it. Once you're once you want to raise your gun, get it in a good grip on it, keeping your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot, and then you can put your finger on the trigger and punch it right towards the target, okay? Boy, that looks pretty good with that big 10 5/8 inch barrel, doesn't it, hey? So anyways, one final point with that, the whole business of drawing a revolver, because we're talking about single action use, one step that you should incorporate into every holster draw is when you put the gun back in your holster, look down, hold it like this, look down at it, and observe the hammer, making sure that that hammer is decocked before you put it back in your holster. So that about wraps it up. I hope this video has been helpful to someone out there. I think it covers a subject area that isn't emphasized perhaps enough, with all the time spent on semi-autos. I think revolvers really have their place and deserves a little bit more discussion. So if you like this video, consider subscribing to the Way to Native Chronicles, and make comments, suggestions if you like, in the comments section. Always like hearing from you, and if there are some things that you'd like me to cover in the future, by all means let me know. So until then, enjoy yourself, be safe out there, and I'll see you next time.